Welcome to the Grow Renaissance podcast. Let's nourish the world.
Welcome back to Pasture Primetime with Neil, where we're exploring the roots of future of regenerative agriculture, one story, one conversation at a time. I'm your host, Neil, and today we're zooming out a bit to look at the bigger picture behind the plate: climate finance, project development, and the capital it takes to regenerate land at scale. Joining me today is Bradford Willis, founder of Amwell Street, a climate finance and project development firm that's helping unlock the funding mechanisms needed to transition agriculture from extractive to regenerative. Bradford brings a rare blend of financial insights and boots on the ground pragmatism, working at the intersection of carbon markets, ecosystem restoration, and community-driven land use. We'll talk about what it takes to build trust in climate finance, how to align investors with real-world ecological outcomes, and why regenerative projects don't just need funding, they need the right kind of funding. If you've ever wondered how we turn good intentions into lasting impact, or how we move capital at the speed of climate, this one's for you. Bradford, it's a real pleasure to have you here today. I'm looking forward to learning more about your firm and some of the work that you do. Maybe you could introduce yourself to our audience.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. As Neil knows, as you know, Neil, I wear a number of hats. So I will start with my first hat, which, as you mentioned, is Amwell Street. Again, you said it well, but Amwell Street is essentially a project development and climate finance firm focused on project development, as well as some of the key interventions at the policymaking and finance level, essentially to create the perfect storm for regenerative projects to flourish. Again, we take a boots on the ground approach, and I would say an air game to make sure that a project has all the right enabling factors to really help it get off the ground. Secondarily, I wear a couple of hats that help keep me involved in all of these circles where policymakers exist and where the banks exist, which one being the Columbia Center for Sustainable Investment, which is abbreviated as CCSI. CCSI does sustainable development, sustainable investment work globally, specifically working on the mandate of the banking institutions and the Beyond Bretton Woods foundations to actually finance the transition, whether it be energy related or regen ag related, and to play a role in repairing our global economy. The third role that I have is, again, part-time, but it's another important piece of the puzzle, which is I am an advisor to the UN Climate Change High-Level Champions, whose specific mandate is to actually enable and mobilize private sector action in support of the Paris Agreement. So way back in COP21, when the countries decided that they needed more private sector activity and they needed more private sector push to help the governments get to where they needed to go. And every year, one person who's local to the hosting country is nominated to be the high-level champion, and they have a support staff of experts who help them be fully briefed on everything related to specific topics and to have as much impact as possible. Those are my three main hats, among some other smaller hats that I wear. But again, those take up most of my time, and I will get into it. But I spend most of my time in Europe, Africa, and in Asia now on a project which I'm happy to share more on as well.
Yeah, looking forward to diving in and hearing a little bit about that. One thing I'd like to, we talked about sort of stepping back and taking a sort of a more holistic view of what's going on here, and the work you're doing is very meaningful. I'd love to hear from your perspective outside of climate, or maybe with climate, what's working well within the agriculture/climate market space today. And being a little bit biased and coming from that agriculture space, that's specifically, I'd be curious to hear your perspectives around that.
It's a great question. I will come at it from the financing side. I think what has worked well, and this is going to sound quite simple, but I think you will appreciate this, and the listeners will appreciate this. What has worked well is putting money and resources in the hands of smallholder farmers, which again, sounds simple and sounds straightforward, but often there is an intermediary, whether it be an NGO or a UN agency that seeks to actually be the implementer or the agent of change in some emerging economy. So whether they're looking to develop a new crop or they're looking to transition land to increase yield, generally they want to play some controlling role in whatever that project looks like. The projects that I've seen recently and the movement that I've seen take place that has an impact is institutions taking a step back, including the UN system, and saying, we trust the landowners to know what's best for the land that they live on, and we're willing to commit resources without necessarily having absolute control over the development of that specific project or that specific land. The way that takes shape is actually financing programs like transition funds, where capital will be pulled into, in the form of grants, into an aggregated pool of financing that will be released to farmers based on certain performance indicators. And I know, Neil, we talk about this a lot, but the best way of ensuring that model works is making sure that farmers can actually report on the key performance indicators of things like soil health, but in just general, the entire cycle of regenerative agriculture, in a way where they don't have a dependency on external parties, verification bodies, other agencies to come in and manage those processes for them. So the perfect storm is where money is made available through these kind of, again, primarily concessionary, but can be non-concessionary as the program develops. And at the same time, the farmers are given the power to actually report on the development work themselves. And so they become the stewards of their own transition. And I think that is definitely the programs that I support, the programs I know you support as well. And we'll get into it, but that leads you to a big question of how best to equip these farmers to manage these transitions once they do have the capital. And of course, that's where data and technology becomes absolutely critical, especially decentralized technology.
Amazing.
Again, so that's my take, but I know we'll get into the technology piece as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I'm glad to hear that it's such a positive perspective in terms of getting capital into the hands of smallhold farmers, particularly Europe, Pan-Africa countries, and into Asia. Conversely, we also hear a lot of misuse of spends on the dollars. There's a report that was just put out yesterday on LinkedIn. I think I saw it. I think you even forwarded it to me about the 15 years of certain billionaires' funds that we won't mention here, being used and not seeing any traction and real momentum on the back end. So the same question, where are the gaps or where are the constraints and deltas in terms of getting the capital effectively into those smallholder hands and it being used for the intent that it's being used for or designed for?
Completely. That report, again, as you said, we won't mention the institution who managed that program, but just an incredible case study into wasted catalytic capital that could have made a massive difference from a Pan-African food system sense. And instead, in some countries I saw in the report, had a net negative impact on the growth of crop yield per year over year. So it was, not only did they not achieve their targets, but they hampered the traditional growth trajectory of some of these countries from a food system standpoint, which was just shocking. To your question about the constraints and how to address them, I feel like I was reading, I think still only 3 to 5% of climate finance goes directly to smallholder farmers. So in that 95+% of climate finance, you have a lot going to, of course, commercial farming, but you have a lot going to what I call the messy middle, which you and I always talk about, which is intermediaries, banks, transaction asset owners, NGOs, consultancies, which there's a lot of, who are skimming off the top of these funds that are set up to actually, of course, go into projects. And by the time that capital gets to the project, it has been, whittled down to almost nothing that can be actually used to create large scale change, even across one, farm, or if you aggregate a number of smallholder farms into a bigger tract of land, you almost have this situation where you start off with enough capital, and then when it gets into the hand, figuratively, of the farmer, it's pennies on the dollar. So, in my opinion, that is currently changing. I think that is a paradigm that has existed for the last 5 to 10 to 15 to 20 to 30 years, especially with USDA and other large foreign development agencies focused on agriculture development in other countries, where they have their own sovereign interests. And so they don't actually have the best interest of those countries at heart. I won't overly criticize any specific actor, but the U.S. has been incredibly active all over the world for the past half a century. And in some cases that's been good. In a lot of cases it hasn't. I think now we finally see the rise of middle powers, where we've got the BRICS. We've got countries that necessarily weren't global superpowers in years past, who have the ability to do two things. One, develop their own economies and their own regenerative agriculture landscape. And then two, finance other small, medium to small countries or small island states as well, to support their transition. And I think in general, those countries typically, not always, are much more aligned in their values and in their experience to those countries that still require some support and finance for development. So you've got a reordering of the global order of climate finance and where it's flowing from specific countries to other countries. The last thing I will say on what is changing is, I think, because commitments and targets have not been met, there's increased scrutiny on the use of funding, which is great. We even see that in the U.S. government, but in the case of regenerative agriculture and in sustainable development broadly, there is increased scrutiny, and we have the ability, like never before, to assess the impact of specific programs through AI, through forensic accounting with support from distributed ledgers and things like that. So it's harder to hide. So all of that misuse and state capture that occurs in developing countries, I hope will further be reduced by those technologies and by that general paradigm shift. And we'll see where we are, I guess, 5 to 10 years from now.
Amazing. So in short, to summarize, really good in terms of capital can be accessed and it can get down to smallhold, or farmers, agriculturalists in general, doesn't have to be smallhold. The work you do is, Pan-Africa, Asia, a lot of smallholds there, so I understand that. Conversely, on the other side, it's the management of those funds needs a little tighter constraint around it to build more transparency, trust, and allocation. Maybe you can talk a little bit about your perspective around regenerative agriculture. And it's a term that's thrown out there quite a bit. It's a term that I think is often misused in the context of sustainable agriculture. But I'd love to get your take on that.
Yes, I will humbly admit that compared to you and compared to many of the listeners of the podcast and many in the community, I'm still a student. A couple of things that I've learned is...
Aren't we always a student?
Yes, always learning, always a student. So I'm humbly a converted, focus on clean technology to focusing on the health of our soil. And I remember meeting at COP28, the 4P1000 group, and they gave to me a statistic. If we repair our soil, we'll reduce our GHG emissions globally, or CO2 equivalent, by 30+%. And I just couldn't quite believe that opportunity for carbon reduction and carbon drawdown was not being financed and was not being discussed more centrally in global net zero planning and global sustainability planning, in sovereign wealth planning, and in country level planning. So it was an amazing, awakening moment for myself. in my journey in trying to understand regenerative agriculture, I feel like it is one of those words that, as people have shifted away, and I know, Neil, we've talked about this, people have shifted away from sustainability, they are now picking up regenerative. And there's a risk where regenerative starts to lose its meaning. And so recently I have tried to understand regenerative agriculture a little bit outside of the outside of the pressures that come in from it becoming a household name, where it just becomes something people talk about, then people try to certify it, people try to put a rubber stamp on it, and then people try to sell it. And before getting into that, spiral, I'm just trying to understand, okay, well, what does it mean to have a regenerative system on a piece of land that is being farmed or that is raising cattle or something of the sort? I wrongly assumed, that, and I think a lot of people would be, wrongly would have a misplaced understanding of regenerative, thinking that animals are not an important part of that equation. I think a lot of environmentalists are vegetarians or vegans, which is great, but they think, therefore, a regenerative farm wouldn't actually have components of that natural system, that natural cycle that includes animals and cattle and all of these different components in it. And of course, they would potentially question the use of manure and other composting material that's organic or is waste from animal sources. And so I think regenerative gets confused with some of those understandings of what's potentially a good diet for a human being or what is considered healthy. I think what I've landed on is what is healthy for the earth has nothing to do with our understanding of our own society and whatever trends around health and nutrition that we get, that we latch onto as a global community. It purely has to do with what is the health of the soil, how, the microbiome content, what is the actual rewilding or what is the actual biodiversity context or content of a specific place meant to look like, what is its threshold compared to its baseline. I know you know these things much better than me, but understanding that regenerative is multifaceted, that it is not human-centric, and that, yes, and I know you're working on cattle projects, animals and beef and animal byproducts are part of that ecosystem. And so we just, as much as we can, need to find the right balance. I constantly am questioning, when I'm doing work around the world and looking and meeting farmers or meeting policymakers, what does regenerative mean for their local context? Because there's always this kind of cultural aspect that no one quite talks about, which is an interesting layer that creates somewhat some cognitive dissonance from region to region. What is good land practice in the rice fields in China is not good practice or water use in South America. And I think that is the last lesson I've taken away, which is, and everyone in agriculture will know this, but it's something us people who work in academia and in government have to learn is agriculture, regeneration, ecosystem management, land management is place-based and is specific to bioregions, is specific to local constraints. And so understanding that there is no one size that fits all, that, every single project should be taken on with its own, basically with a blank slate, with an initial understanding that we could do anything. Anything is kind of on the, is possible. We could implement any specific program, and we will consistently, as we said at the beginning, we will learn from this multi-year process of trying to heal the land and seeing where we go. So that's my idea of regeneration. It's not so science-based, but it's more, I would say, based on experience. Yeah.
No, you said it very well. And I think the takeaway there that I've talked about often is, hyper-localization, and then we look at regeneration with that lens on at all times. So
Right.
Some great points there. I'd love to maybe just pull the thread on Animal Street a little bit. How and why did Animal Street come about, and are you working on any great projects currently?
Yes. So Amwell Street is really the byproduct of two things that I experienced in my travels globally, whether it be to South America, to the Middle East, which is generally, and this is not always true, but generally, there is not enough work being done um, outside of institutions or country interests to bridge the gap between climate finance, between policymakers and landowners or project developers. And in general, the number of people who can play that intermediary role, which again, it's a market share and it's a market in general that often gets eaten up by agencies, by NGOs, who sometimes are very effective, but often it is just a very inefficient use of resources to progress projects, because that's the ultimate point. What gets lost in between is an entire industry built on managing the money, managing the policy implementation from a high level down to the project level. So that was one of the main that was one of the main motivations. The second one was that the type of projects that are getting financed and the use of investments generally was not stringent enough. And that sounds somewhat pessimistic, but my experience in the hydrogen industry was a tale of wasted billions, multiple billions wasted on. Again, it's the experience of any growing industry that it will have. It will have an S curve, hopefully, but it will at the beginning it will grind to a halt. It will start up again. It will have its trials and tribulations. But I think what I experienced in the hydrogen sector was that there were clear winners, clear no regret activities replacing gray hydrogen in our energy mix. In some cases, not in all cases, so I don't want to get eaten alive by any of the listeners, replacing some of the ammonia production with green ammonia. In some cases, not in all. There were some clear no regret activities and parts of our economic model and part of our resource consumption and demand models that we could absolutely displace with a low carbon solution. And yet we focused on planes, trains, automobiles. Just an incredible amount of money went into trying to create a market out of nothing. And so the second motivation was, instead of being market driven, let's listen to communities, let's listen to the land, let's actually develop projects that are for Earth, not for any sovereign interest, not for necessarily for the creation of a market where there isn't one. And I know you always talk about, is there a buyer? So having a very realistic discussion on the front end on, are we putting something in place that is needed, that helps develop, a relative, has a net positive impact on sustainability in general, but of course on communities as well, and setting just an incredibly high watermark for development that I don't think exists. I feel like in general, development is somewhat of an archaic industry where engineers come in, they conduct a pre-feasibility study, cost estimation, they determine the commercial feasibility, bankability, financiers provide the funding, some blend of concessional and some blend of debt and equity. And if the market exists and there's offtake, then it happens. And I inherently think that is not the right way to go about it. I think it almost has to be flipped on its head to say, is this a market that we want to exist in 50 years? Okay.
Right.
Yes, that market is one that we want to exist. So we want to support some of the enabling activities and some of the projects that should be developed to create that market. But if it doesn't, and there's an opportunity that comes into our portfolio, I feel like part of our part of our belief system is that you say no more than you say yes, because that is the best way to ensure that you have a certain quality in your decision making that's being not led by purely by profit or purely by market making activities. So that has been kind of the two sides of the same coin that have driven the creation of Amwell Street. And of course it's a global endeavor, because systems change is global, but at the same time it's a grounded endeavor, because as you said, it's hyper local. So trying to balance those two things. Yeah.
Wonderful. I know it's been quite a journey. It sounds like, the process is not a linear line, and putting together a venture such as Amwell Street. I'm really thankful that you're out there, because I think it's leading to some traction in aligning some of those key parties and stakeholders. You've talked about a project that you're sort of undertaking and building the framework around in South Africa. I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about that, and maybe put the pieces together on how Amwell Street is connecting the dots. And I know it's still early days, but would love to sort of pull a thread on that a little.
Yes, absolutely. I think you know this well, Neil, with your strong connections to South Africa, and I, of course, just for listeners, have spent the past 3 years going back and forth to South Africa, primarily working with them on their green investment strategy, for essentially their economy-wide decarbonization plan, and in general their kind of expected growth, green growth, all the way to 2050. In that journey, both in the Northern Cape, in Johannesburg and Cape Town, with you, Neil, as well, but with boots on the ground, having discussions with local policymakers like the city of Cape Town, having local, conversations with the tertiary co-op, having conversations with smallholder farmers, having conversations with the big government entities as well, the DSTI, the Department of Trade and Science, Trade and Industry, the development finance institutions, including IDC. Basically, what became clear is that, South Africa is just in a very interesting point in time of land redistribution, which, of course, as you know well, has to do with apartheid and basically giving land back. They also, at the same time, have a food insecurity issue. So you have this unique blend, and this is the type of opportunity that I like to think Amwell Street is well positioned for, where there's an intersection or there's a point where these things are meeting, where you've got the need to develop or transition land in a meaningful way, where there's resources and funding or financing available to the tribes or available to smallholder farmers to actually make use of the land in a way that's regenerative, which I know we spoke about already. And at the same time,
So what does that?
Yeah.
What does that look like? Is that the regenerative planning? Is that actual implementation? Is that education? What are the pieces there that?
It's a great question. So 3 things, I guess. The first being, you need a certain amount of capital to be essentially set aside, or at least aggregated and attributed to this land redistribution. So it's not just that you'd be giving land back for free, but you'd be giving it back, and you would be providing some kind of concessionary financing to help those farmers institute some program, which could, of course, look a certain way or could be kind of bespoke for every individual farmer.
And correct me if I'm wrong, just for some of our listeners, this returning of the land is more around land that's sort of sitting derelict at the moment, that was
right.
appropriated to one way or the other. It's currently not somebody's farmland that's being pulled out and repositioned. So
right.
It's land that could otherwise be farmed or regenerated, that's sitting derelict at the moment. It's currently maybe under a municipality holding or some other holding that is now being turned back to the local people in that region. And you're looking to get involved, bring key stakeholders together, find some mechanism of funding so that you can work with groups such as Kohima and others to regenerate that land. Is that correct? Do I have that correct?
That's 100% correct. So there's a land retitling that's happening. And then at the same time, there's a gap because the land will continue to sit derelict or unused in some meaningful way for the economy. And again, an economy which is not well employed, has food insecurity issues, has energy security issues. So there's a ton of opportunity to create spaces where there is actual economic value that's being given back, of course, to the local communities, but is generally providing jobs and is generally adding to the general economic and fiscal stability of the country. Generally, so that is one part. The land retitling is a process that is policy driven, is regulatory, but could be tied to soil stewardship. And I think that's, again, where the opportunity around that land redistribution is so interesting, because if you can tie some soil stewardship and some performance-based indicators around soil health to the land redistribution, and then you can give them long-term financing, so not just what is typical, which is maybe 1 to 2 years or 24 months of concessionary finance, at which point 90% of farms would fail. You actually give longer-term financing for performance-based outcomes related to soil health, and you tie that to the retitling of the land. That to me is it's a unique question of blends finance and policy and local community-based development, but it's kind of the one that interests me. And of course, there's a huge global water issue, but in the Western Cape, there's a huge water issue as well. So I think the role that land could play generally in increasing the watersheds, increasing the health of the aquifers, increasing generally, again, the economic stability of that entire corridor, which goes all the way up to Namibia, is incredible. And if you were to do that well, I just imagine a universe where you could do it in a Pan-African sense, and you could look at the entire African free trade corridor, and you could actually look at creating again a movement of you could say soil health based outcomes where people are rewarded but with long-term financing for producing products and or managing their land in a regenerative way, and that would drive regenerative development throughout that entire corridor, and from a Pan-African sense would create a flow of production and offtake of sustainable products like probably has never before been seen. So that would be, the pie in the sky.
Right. Tell me a little bit about your thoughts around Web3. I know I brought this wonderful world into your perspective, and certainly a conversation piece that sort of interweaves in everything that you've talked about, from finance mechanisms. You had mentioned at the top of the conversation decentralization technologies or decentralized technologies. Love to hear your thoughts around that and in how that interweaves into everything that you're discussing and everything that you're working on.
Yeah. I think the reason decentralized finance is one of the most interesting things in the world to me right now is because if you look at Africa's macroeconomic context, it is riddled with debt. And whether that debt is to foreign state-owned enterprises, a lot of them being in China, a lot of them being in the US, a lot of them being in the Middle East from an Africa sense, or that debt is to IMF or the Bretton Woods institutions, it is debt that they will likely never be able to pay back. It will be continued to be extended, where the terms will be continued to be refinanced. And again, they will sit in this cycle and this continued debt trap that will keep them poor and resource. Even though they're resource rich, they will be monetarily poor for the next 50 to 100 years. The ability for ecosystem regeneration to directly reward landowners and have an instantaneous flow of capital that, again, avoids that messy middle that we always talk about, central banking, governments, foreign development agencies, is to me one of the great opportunities for sustainable development in emerging economies of our generation. If we could do that well, I can imagine a situation where you'd have a really bizarre, situation where the general population in certain industries, like in farming, but in others that we've spoken about as well, where you had this direct flow of financing, where the government would actually have more debt than the general populace, which is not usually the case. Usually an indebted country has a populace that is generally in debt as well, whether that be through their own credit risk or through their own credit borrowing or otherwise. So you could imagine a situation where actually the fiscal entity of the sovereign, the country, has continued to borrow in that traditional debt trap for major infrastructure projects, but that the smallholder farmers and people who are doing development on a small to medium scale have actually tapped into a market that avoids all of that messy middle that we speak about, and eventually uplifts them without the support of the central government, which is typically in development is unprecedented. That is not a story that has ever played out with any regularity in the history of humankind. So if we could decouple those two things, that reliance on the debt, the debt trap and the borrowing tendencies of emerging economies and the interest rates that they borrow at, with the general wealth increase, the increase in wealth of the working class and of the lower to middle class, then that would just be, again, that would be one of the most incredible achievements I think that we could possibly have in this century.
Yeah, that's well said. And disintermediating banking relationships does not mean that there is a turning of the tides. The banks will be around, the central organizations. This offers just a diversification in the financial mechanisms of which small farmers and the projects that you're working on at Animal Street are really focused on. The other piece that I want to get your thoughts on around, and you've mentioned this quite a bit throughout a lot of the feedback that you shared and your perspectives, the underpinning of trust and transparency, whether it's governmental, NGO, data, the allocation of funds, the use of information, to drive data-driven decision-making, KPIs that, need to be focused on. What does that look like to you, and how does Web3 play a role in that?
I'm taking a quick note because it's a great point, and I feel like the whole idea of trust infrastructure, how we build the infrastructure of trust, is a question that you and I talk about quite a bit. And it's one that I feel like these are willing, I'm talking about the coalition of the willing, who are probably already willing adopters of this way of seeing the world. But generally, the more I read things recently, the more I see that people are acknowledging that there isn't trust for the carbon markets. There isn't trust for government. There isn't trust in a capitalist economy that seeks growth of 5 to 6% year over year. There isn't trust necessarily in all of these institutional components that have been around for the entire modern era. So again, Web3's ability to create this trust infrastructure, which is not owned by any institution, cannot be changed. So we avoid all those issues of corruption. I mean, I think the thing that people in the US, and again, I am from the US, don't realize is that much of the world still deals with an immense amount of corruption. And that is not necessarily corruption that people typically think about, which might come from the top down, might come from the presidency's office, or might come from leaders of government. But every layer of government, every time a transaction happens, at the municipal level, at the provincial level, at the regional level with the regional alliances, and investment treaties, where all of these things are ways of ensuring for certain people to ensure that they get some certain amount of money or resources from some type of economic activity. So for Web3 to play this role in building the trust infrastructure, and again, I feel like that trust infrastructure is regenerative agriculture is probably the most important use case, but trust infrastructure in renewables as well, like the way that we manage time of use, the way that we look at time of use of electrons over the course of the day is also an incredibly difficult but important field of inquiry, where people are starting to finally, with Web3 and with more real-time data sensors, are now able to understand what is the actual source of the electrons they're using. Are they green? And so I guess same for the products in regenerative agriculture field. Is this a regenerative product? Yes. It's not a question that I need to explore. It's the data is immediately available to me, and it's done through Web3. And so I think in all fields, in the renewable energy discussion and certificates of origin, in the regenerative agriculture, and value add product space, and even in the mining space, which you and I speak about as well, critical minerals is probably going to be one of the most contentious resource classes for the next 50 to 100 years. And so being able to understand if a lithium ion battery was sourced well is going to become, and the role that blockchain and Web3 can play in building that trust infrastructure is just, it cannot be understated. And what I hope, the last thing I'll say is, I hope that we focus our efforts and resources on building that trust infrastructure, not on building reporting frameworks and taxonomies and programs and processes, because I that again, for me, that would be a waste of resources.
Yeah, excellent. We're nearing the end of this podcast segment, and I think you've shared some really enlightening information, Bradford, around what you're doing at Amwell, and the climate financing, sustainable financing, regen financing, these impact projects, and there's probably a lot of follow-up conversation that we could have in any one of these areas that is very in-depth. But I wanted to give you the floor for the last few minutes here, just to share anything that you really would love our audience to know about, and just let them know what exciting things are up and coming on your agenda, and potentially how they can reach out to you if they have some ideas or thoughts.
Yes, absolutely. So in general, always a lot going on, but I will mention a few of the things that are in the kind of immediate windshield of stuff I'm working on. As we march towards the end of June, we'll have the Financing for Development meeting in Sevilla, Spain, which will focus on finance for development, and basically a renewed commitment to some of the development financing funds, including those in Africa. So including the capital that's needed for exactly all the projects that we're talking about. So important decision-making will happen from the governments at that meeting. And again, that's June 30th. I will be there in a couple capacities, but specifically pushing forward a lot of the work on the cost of capital, which I do with Colombia, which is focused on reducing the borrowing costs for emerging countries. Look out for, we released a report on the cost of capital, which I'm sure a lot of people listening would find interesting. What I hope going forward will happen is we will actually launch the UN Council of Sustainable Finance Practitioners. That will look at essentially a project by project transaction level group of professionals, of which I am just a mere student. So still learning the game from the best. But that group hopefully will work on some of these things that we're talking about today. Regenerative agriculture can be one, but in general, the regenerative infrastructure of tomorrow's kind of world, so to speak. And so hopefully that group will get announced in Sevilla. I will be going back and forth to Asia, where I am working on the development of the integrated regional ASEAN energy system. And then again, the work with Amwell Street, we will be focused on South Africa and also on the Caribbean. So looking to push forward, but announcements are still TBD, but looking to push forward a couple of projects in South Africa and in the Caribbean that are specifically focused on, again, these projects that really are needed, and you're building the commons, so that we avoid, again, as much of this potential tragedy of the commons that is we're hurtling towards in terms of all the systemic risks that are being presented to us from nature degradation and otherwise. So Sevilla, Asia, and then I'll be with you, Neil, hopefully down in South Africa and then in Caribbean, and hopefully we'll have a couple project announcements. In general, to get in touch with me by email, but the world runs on WhatsApp, as do I. So WhatsApp is available as well. And we do have a website, which people can use as well. So I'm always available.
What is that website?
Well, website is amwellstreet.com. So pretty simple. And yep, anyone can reach out anytime. I am, as Neil knows, and as probably everyone who's listened to this podcast knows, I don't want to say I'm a generalist, but I'm involved in a lot of different things. And so I'm always interested to hear about anything, because I think everything is incredibly interesting. And then bring in the specialists like Neil to actually do the good work. So
amazing. Well, and thank you for that vote of confidence there. Bradford, this has been a very enlightening conversation. I really do thank you for the work that you're doing in the financial and alignment of stakeholders for in-field, inland projects that are very much needed. And certainly renewable energies, I know you touched on that. It to me, is just part of that regenerative system. And, when we think about it from an engineering standpoint, systems of systems approach, that integration is seamless to me. And so regenerative systems include that renewable energy, and our lands sustain that and produce and help that.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to further conversations, some of the engagements that you've brought us in on, and how we can continue to bring the Grow blockchain as a instrument and tool that can be harnessed for the empowerment of everyone involved in the improvement of lives, as well as our natural ecosystems. So thank you for your time this morning. I know it's your afternoon, my morning, but I really appreciate you taking a moment to share with us, and look forward to staying in touch here.
Of course. Thank you. Thank you, Neil. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Grow Renaissance podcast. Make sure you like, share, and subscribe this episode. Remember, it will take a community of us to do the best in the world and truly nourish not only ourselves, but the planet, the atmosphere, the soil, the plants, and the animals on it. So make sure you spread this message anywhere that you can.